Henry Smith.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be called to speak in this important EU withdrawal debate, and particularly after so many impassioned speeches from the front bench to the back benches. It's almost exactly 3 years ago that it was confirmed that the EU membership referendum was going to take place in June, and of course June 2016, and of course it's over 2.5 years now since that referendum took place. In my constituency, the decision to leave the European Union was 58%, and of course across the country as a whole it was 52%. Since that time, as the Honourable Lady before has just mentioned, we have had a general election in 2017 where I understand 589 now elected Right Honourable and Honourable members of this House stood on a manifesto commitment to deliver the result of that referendum. The message I have, and just the other day I was walking down a local shopping parade, tailgate parade in my constituency, and typically, as is the case, somebody came up to me and wanted to know about the current Brexit debate in Parliament and said, why aren't we just getting on with the decision that we made just over 2.5 years ago? And that is a compelling argument. Now, we have heard earlier on this afternoon, Mr. Speaker, about calls for a so-called people's vote. I would argue we had a people's vote in 2016. We've also heard calls for an extension to Article 50 to delay our departure from the European Union. What we have also heard from those honourable members is the concern about uncertainty of Brexit. The one thing that will maintain and continue uncertainty is by questioning the democratic decision again that was taken in a second referendum. That would certainly do a lot to damage our democracy and prolong uncertainty, as would a delay to Article 50 before we even get into the issues of whether the remaining 27 members of the EU would allow Article 50 to be extended, and the issue again that's been highlighted, Mr. Speaker, by honourable and right honourable members of EU elections should we go beyond July if Article 50 were to be extended. Mention has also been made that we should be taking no deal off the table. I have never known a negotiation where one party goes in and says that they will walk, they're not willing to walk away from that negotiation. I hear some jeering from the opposition benches, many of whom are sponsored by trade unions. I can't imagine a trade union going into a negotiation with an employer saying that they wouldn't be willing. They wouldn't be willing to strike in those negotiations. I'm happy to give way to the honourable gentleman.
The problem with this walk-away analogy is that in any other negotiation, when you walk away, the status quo applies. That is not the case here. When we walk away from this, a whole new and terribly damaging set of new things come into force. That's why this analogy with a business deal is so fatuous, ridiculous and wrong.
I'm very grateful that the honourable gentleman has mentioned the status quo, because I don't think the status quo of remaining inside the European Union is good for this country. The European Union is increasingly a protectionist bloc. The European Union is not outward and global in its approach. This country, with its unique global links, can use those to have a much more positive future instead of locking itself into the ever closer union, that is producing a demographic deficit at the heart of the EU, and not even to mention things like a European army. I'm delighted to give way to my honourable friend.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, my friend. He very clearly makes the point that that we didn't vote for this. We did not vote for the status quo. It's quite clear 17.4 million people voted to leave. Would he agree with me that the inevitable outcome, if we don't have a deal, is no deal? That is not the status quo.
I think we've seen people in this country reject the status quo, and I actually see Brexit as an opportunity for wider constitutional reform about devolving power, about changing the way the other place works fundamentally, and many other aspects as well. People did want change. I think actually throughout Europe, throughout many EU member states, there is a real desire for there to be change. And I think if we don't respect that democratic decision, then some of the civil unrest that we've seen on the streets of Paris and Lyon and Marseille, and some of the economic contraction that we see in Germany and the crisis in countries like Italy will be visited on this country. I'll be happy to give way to my honourable friend from Dover.
My honourable friend is making a typically very powerful speech. Can you think of anything more craven than for members of this House to vote one day to trigger Article 50 and then to say 2 years later, oh, we didn't mean to do that, we need to carry on? Isn't that just craven and frankly pathetic?
We've seen significant majorities both in favour of leaving the European Union in terms of the around about 80% of members of Parliament elected at the last general election who said they would follow through on, I don't have any time, I do apologise. Actually, yes, I will give way very briefly.
I wonder if my honourable friend could remind us of the promise that was made by the Leave campaign that he supported, which repeatedly said that we would not leave the European Union until a trade deal securing our future trading relationship with the EU had been secured. Does he remember those broken promises?
Well, I never made that promise in my supporting leaving the European Union. I do believe that a deal is the best way forward, but let's not forget that the vast majority of honourable right honourable members in this House voted for the legislation to leave the European Union on March the 29th, and if no deal is the result of that, that is the default position of the legislation. I will give very briefly.
Thank you very much for reminding us of what was said in the past. Of course, in the Conservative Party manifesto that I stood in 2017, it stated very clearly that we will seek a deep and special partnership with the EU, including a new free trade agreement and including a customs agreement. Does he still stand by that promise?
Yes, we absolutely should be seeking and honouring a deep and close relationship with our neighbours and allies in Europe. But the trouble with a customs union, which the side opposite are advocating, is that it would actually prevent us from doing those global free trade deals, which actually is the key in a world that is getting smaller to our prosperity. The key, I think, to this country's future prosperity is our unique global links and being a conduit to our proximity to Europe. And we need to be robust in those ongoing negotiations, and I support the Prime Minister in continuing those ongoing negotiations. I have never known an EU negotiation not go down to the last moment. And with that, I remain optimistic about our futures. And for goodness sake, Mr. Speaker, we should be more optimistic as a House and as a country, because our best years are ahead of us.
Anna McLaurin.